for you today. Before we get started, we have to call up our Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman to come on up and give us greeting and introduction, please. Yes, there's. Come on, y'all can do better than that. Yeah.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm so excited about today's panel discussion. First of all, I'm so excited that I got Raz Baraka, the mayor of the largest city in the state of New Jersey, as the facilitator of this discussion. And I think you can look at this panel and you can see where they're all from. And you can recognize that they all work in the social justice space and in the real justice space. And they come from different perspectives. And that's the purpose of our coming together today. It is not just to discuss legislation, although legislation might come up. It is not to discuss anything specific. It is to discuss their definition of real justice and the elements that need to go into it. So let us have a robust discussion. Let us be grateful to God for the opportunity in this free country to have this discussion and to make our decisions so that we can make our changes come November. Peace.
I have to say that I'm humbled and honored to be the moderator here. I'm so thankful that our representative, Bonnie Watson Coleman, gave me the opportunity to do this. There's some incredible people on this panel who I respect tremendously. It's a lot of you, so we're going to have to temper our comments a little bit. But this discussion is very important. It's always been important for us, for particularly black and brown people in this country, but it becomes more and more salient because we have Jeff Sessions as the highest legal authority in the land, who is doing everything in his power to push back on the small gains that we have made over periods of years. And we're glad to have our Congresswoman fighting to push back against the madness that's coming out of that administration. So I'm just going to give a brief of who we have up here, and I'm sure they'll get into it as we ask some questions. We're going to jump right into the discussion. So we have Shakira Young, who is the senior counsel at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. We have Kevin Gilbert, National Education Association Executive Committee, here with us today. We also have Brian Haygood from Newark, New Jersey, President and CEO of New Jersey Institute of Social Justice. Jocelyn McCurdy, who is the Deputy Director at the Washington Legislative Office of the American Civil Liberties Union. And of course, Judge Victoria Pratt, former Chief Judge, Newark Municipal Court, just all around superstar for us in the state of New Jersey. Hillary Shelton serves as Director to the NAACP's Washington Bureau, Senior Vice President for Advocacy and Policy. And Eric Young served as the National President of the American Federation of Government Employees Council of Prison Locals. So as you can see, that's a heavy panel. We're going to get right into the discussion. If we have a little bit of time left, we'll open up the floor and get some questions from the audience. I'm sure you have some questions. Questions, though, right? Not statements. The first thing I want to put out because you know folks going to have statements. Diatribes even. So the first question I'm putting to everybody is the U.S. Bureau of Justice estimated that in 2016 there were over 2 million people in U.S. federal, state prisons and county jails, which is the highest incarceration rate in the world. So I'd like to talk about how we got to this point, what were the driving considerations behind the kind of war on drugs, which leads us into some of the answer there, and why it's having such a lasting impact on communities of color, particularly African-American communities around the country. So I'll start with our judge, and then we can move on from there. Yeah.
13.2 million misdemeanor cases are filed about every year. Roughly 12 million jail admissions annually, and 75% of the local jail population is there for non-violent traffic, property, drug, or public disorder offenses. We got there because we have been using a criminal justice approach to a social problem. When the war on drugs began, our communities were frightened by the violence they saw there, by the weaponizing of our communities. So no one questioned when they had these tough on drug laws and prosecutions that were going on. But one of the greatest things and most destructive things that has happened as a result of this war on drugs has been the destruction of our families. And what we see, what I see in court are generations of people coming through our courts. So we haven't stopped the cycle. And so what we really need to do, again, I thank the mayor because it takes crazy, fearless people to change the world, and he was a crazy, fearless leader who, after seeing the crazy things I was doing, decided to make me the chief judge. And a part of what we've been doing and what I've been doing is going around the country and actually globally talking to judges about alternative sentencing, about restoring humanity to the process. The justice system has failed our communities, and it is really now time that we really take these things back and reimagine what justice looks like. And there's so many things. I mean, I don't want to take up too much time just talking about them. But when I've been volunteering at Pelican Bay Prison because I believe that if you want the answers for criminal justice reform, you got to go to the people who have been most impacted by the prison system. And what we find in dealing and talking with them, they've recently started doing exercises where they're mapping out their lives. All of them suffered traumatic violence, trauma at early ages. They were the children that you see in the news when someone's been shot. And where we fail to deal with that trauma, they then become the same people who created those acts of violence. So I think that by applying this criminal justice approach to the war on drugs and the things that were happening, we have just continued to perpetuate this silence, this cycle of incarceration. And we've also ignored what is happening at local government. What is happening at the municipal level? Why are we legislating nuisances into criminal effect? We are criminalizing the behavior of citizens. We are criminalizing their behavior. I was recently in New York, and something as simple as this defendant came to court. I was monitoring a judge, and he had an amplifier offense. And so in New York, you cannot use an amplifier on the street unless you have a license. Where did that come from? That came from the 80s, I'm telling the mayor's age, when young B-boys, black and brown boys, would be on the corner dancing with boomboxes. Yeah. This guy got fined because they criminalized his behavior. In other communities, when kids go outside and play, and they're industrious, they're entrepreneurial. And so we have to be, as legislators in this room, we have to be very careful about what it is we're legislating, because as a judge, we are just imposing laws that really are not appropriate,
Anybody can jump in, pick up from there. Yeah. Go ahead.
Let me just add that there's some of the things that also drive this, quite frankly, are greed.
Yes.
Greed. Those who make money off the suffering of those that are incarcerated. We're going to get a little bit into private prisons in just a minute. I just want to plant this seed as we move in that direction. What we've seen is our prison population grow at extremely large numbers, and then move to justify the utilization of private prisons and the contracting of private prisons to lock our people up in places as well. Let's overfill those in the public domain at a cost of about $25,000 per year per person in a moderate security prison. If you go into the maximum securities, you double that number and talk about how much it costs to keep them there as well. But as we're thinking about how we're paying for it, somebody else is profiting from it as well. So indeed, when we think about our children, it's not surprising when we look at the overall numbers, as we talk about, we're down to about 2.2 million. At the time President Obama went into office, we were about 2.4 million people in our prisons. We started seeing between Obama and Eric Holder and others that provided some leadership for us, a reduction in the number of our prisons. But the last thing Obama did before he left office is to sign an executive order saying no more private prisons. The first thing President Trump did when he came into office is repeal that order so we can start putting in private prisons again. Now, I don't want us to become a conspiracy theorist, but as my daddy used to say, just because I'm paranoid don't mean they're not out to get me.
That's right. My mama said that too, by the way.
Now, President Company accepted. Congressman Bobby Scott just walked in the room again as well. Please give
Yes.
Congressman Scott a big
Yes.
hand for being here and the work he's done for us. One of the reasons he's exceptionally important to this conversation is the years he spent on the House Judiciary Committee fighting these issues, the years he spent now on the House Education Committee and seeing that school-to-prison pipeline effect. No one does it better in addressing the solutions to that than Congressman Bobby Scott. You can give him another big hand for us.
Yes.
So as we're talking about this, if you look at some of the members of Congress and where they invested their money for their future and see how they voted on mandatory minimum sentences, it's an amazing thing to me is that what they actually did is bought their own future retirement on the backs of our children. I'll stop there for just a minute, but I'll look forward to the rest of this
Yes.
conversation.
I would just add, Hillary mentioned something about the school-to-prison pipeline. And one of the drivers in our view of mass incarceration is when we started to reduce resources and investments in education. My colleague from the National Education Association, I'm sure, can pick up on that thread. But reducing resources and investments in education, in housing, in job opportunity and employment, all of those things have an impact on the types of social ills that the judge initially talked about, that we use the criminal legal system to address. And you can't talk about one without the other. And so if we want to reduce crime, if we want to focus on public safety, then we have to talk about the things that work at the very beginning point, and to stop the flow of people into the system to begin with. And that means education, adequate funding of education, especially for those communities that are most in need of it. Adequate resources for jobs and opportunity, and adequate housing and other social supports. It's no, conspiracy that while people are building prisons, and they are building prisons based on educational test scores of third graders and sixth graders, that is what has happened in our country. It's no, conspiracy that while we are saying we want to reform the criminal justice system, we're also putting barriers in place for people with records to have access to food assistance. Congress just did this with the Farm Bill this year. This is just this year. That Congress was trying to limit those who have records from being able to get the necessary assistance with food and access to other public benefits that we all need, especially people who are impoverished. So we can't just talk about how we drove mass incarceration without also talking about some of the lack of resources that were pulled away from communities with respect to education, housing, and employment that have led to some of the problems we see with the criminal justice system.
Can I pick up on that point? So Sakira's point made me think about this question of sort of how we make, or where we make our investments. And we did this research and writing with the Congresswoman that looked at New Jersey has this, what used to be the Bordentown School for Colored Youth, as it was called. It was this prestigious black, I see folks reacting to this, you remember this, it was considered the Tuskegee of the North because it was modeled after Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute. And it opened right after the end of slavery, and New Jersey ran this as a publicly run boarding school. It was an elite black boarding school for black youth. And it was open for about 70 years. It attracted luminaries like Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, Albert Einstein, Mary McLeod Bethune. It really was the pinnacle of black learning. And New Jersey ran it as a publicly run boarding school for more than 50 years. I think it was almost 70 years. And then right after the Brown decision, New Jersey closed this school. And today, the campus is still there. The buildings have been shuttered. The administrative building is still there. It's been shuttered. But on the campus of what was the pinnacle of black learning now sits 2 of New Jersey's 3 youth prisons. And so, to Sakira's point, in a material sense, this is the school-to-prison pipeline realized. New Jersey moved away from making deep investments in black education, here I'm talking about black folks specifically, to incarcerating kids on the same property that was once a place where they achieved higher learning. And in terms of investments, New Jersey spends $60 million every year to incarcerate kids. That amounts to about $281,000 per kid per year of incarceration. Imagine what you could do in the life of a kid were you to invest $281,000. And in New Jersey's upcoming budget, New Jersey has actually deepened its commitment to incarcerating kids. It will go above $300,000 in the coming year. And it's interesting because if you look at New Jersey is often thought of as a beacon for democracy. There are folks which distinguish, New Jersey from, say, South Carolina or Alabama or Hillary's favorite state, Mississippi. But if you look at the numbers, right, you actually find that New Jersey is among the worst in a lot of the most reprehensible ways. So, for example, New Jersey has the highest black to white adult and youth incarceration disparity rate. So for adults, it's 12-1, which means that a black adult in New Jersey is 12 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white adult. And for kids, it's staggering. It's 30-1, which is to say that a black child in New Jersey is 30 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white child. And here's the thing, we know, some smart people in the room, the data shows that black and white people commit most offenses at about the same rate. And even if there's a difference in the way that black folks commit crime, I promise you it's not 12-1, it's certainly not 30-1. And what these disparities reflect, and we can talk more about this, are racially discriminatory policy decisions along the criminal justice spectrum, to Secours Point, from the school to the prison all the way to the incarceration. And so part of what we're seeing is that what drives incarceration is race. And we have to be, particularly as black folks and advocates, have to be clear about naming what those racial disparities reflect. Because if you just say, let's talk about racial disparities, and folks say, well, the reason the racial disparities exist is because you all just commit more crime. If you get better, if you go to church more, if you get more righteous, if you just stop doing bad things, trust in the Lord, we should do that too, right? But if you just stop being bad people, if you just get back to your roots, then you would see those disparities come down. In fact, it's not behavior. It's the way that the system responds to our folks in ways that don't reflect some of the principles we see exercised in other communities. Think about the opioid crisis, for example, and our response to it.
So I want to formally recognize Congressman Bobby Scott from Virginia. He informally recognized you. I want to formally do it from the podium. So let's give him a round of applause. Thank you for your presence here once again. We appreciate it. I want to kind of drag Kevin and Eric into this conversation and talk a little bit more about the other side of it, kind of labor and the other piece of it, and your position on why you think, not only why you think things are the way they are, but what would be our ideal kind of criminal justice system? What should that actually look like in a democracy, to help us move the discussion?
Well, I truly believe that, seeing it firsthand, I've been working with the Bureau of Prisons now for 24 years. I think returning discretion to the judges would be the first step. I think it's too much prosecutorial abuse of discretion, and I believe that returning the discretion back to the judges is the balance beam between the attorneys, the defense and prosecutor and the attorneys. I've actually witnessed firsthand nonviolent offenders coming into the Bureau of Prisons, and I've actually seen them leave the prison more dangerous than when they actually came in. And it's due to the climate, the ideology in the system, seeing black and brown people essentially predominantly trying to protect themselves because the Bureau of Prisons are actually understaffed, so that these gangs metastasize behind the prison walls and fences, and you often see new offenders coming in that basically matriculate to the gangs in the prisons just for safe haven. Is because oftentimes we can't even keep the prison safe just with the manpower that we have. But I truly believe that is the first discretion, and that's one of the reasons why the Council of Prison Locals, when I first came on back in 2013, we actually endorsed Dick Durbin's and Raul Labrador's, believe it or not, Smarter Sentencing Act when they first introduced it.
And I just wanted to jump in and first of all thank Congresswoman Watson Coleman for having this discussion today. Second of all, thank my former boss, Bobby Scott, who is responsible for a lot of the reform that we've even been able to achieve here in Washington through his leadership. And you all need to know that. I mean, it's very appropriate that he is here in this discussion because he has been a leader for years in trying to change the system, particularly the federal system. And when you talk about the federal system, the question is, why are we here? That's one of the questions. How are we here? It's really a simple answer. And it's an answer that's based on history. Again, we need to know our history because if we don't, we're destined to repeat it. And what we are seeing in this administration in these times is a repeat of past history. And that history is based on a war on drugs that was waged by Richard Nixon. All these tactics that this administration, the current Attorney General Jeff Sessions and the current president are straight out of the Nixon playbook. And we need to know that for those of us, some of us that weren't around during Nixon, we need to know that the policies that this administration is supporting and changing are directly related to continuing the war, not only on drugs, but the real war on black and brown people. And we have to know that as we move forward, because that's what this is about. Again, Hillary talked about when the 2 weeks into his tenure as Attorney General, one of the first policies that Attorney General Jeff Sessions reversed was the policy on private prisons. Later on, a few weeks later, the next policy that he focused on was how this Department of Justice charges people who are accused of violating immigration laws, and how they're going to charge them and prosecute them in the federal criminal system. That's the second move. Then later on that same year, in a few months, this is within 6 months of him becoming Attorney General, he changes the charging policy on how Attorney General Eric Holder created a policy in the way he looked at how they charge drug cases. Because you have to, the thing that is important to understand, in the federal system, almost 50% of the people that are in the Federal Bureau of Prisons are there for drug offenses. And so in order to reform the system, you have to reform the way drug laws are on the books, and you have to reform the way that prosecutors charge drug crimes in the federal system. And that's exactly what Eric Holder did in 2013. This administration has turned that back. So what does that say in the first 6 months of this administration? They focused on policies that relate to black and brown people, immigration, and black and brown people in terms of how they charge drug cases. This is about being a war on black and brown people. We have to know that, or we're destined to repeat the history of the war on drugs and President Nixon.
So I want to go ahead, Kevin, you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna jump in here and say, first of all, I don't know how I got picked to be on this panel.
I'm about to tell you.
I mean, it's like, I'm thinking business. I don't know whether to jump in or just pay attention, but anyway. I just wanted to just say that in 2015, what the National Education Association decided to do was take a bold step and develop a strategy which we call racial justice in education, which generally points its direction towards institutional racism. And everything that we're hearing, everything that I heard on the panel talks about, the real problem here is the fact that this institutional racist system, or the institutional racism systems that are prevalent on top of each other, are continuing to perpetuate this overall cycle and this thing that continues to happen. But I think the thing that needs to really happen here is, one of the things we are promoting is the fact that we need to get back to, we need to transform the way things are being done and the way things are being talked about. In order to change and shift the system, we got to rethink about how we go about attacking this system. And as everyone has said in here, the issue is that you're putting all your money in on the punitive end on it and not putting anything in on the relationship end or the support end on it or the things that people need in order for them to be better. And we're looking at this from a standpoint of how do we penalize someone for breaking a rule as opposed to loving someone on how we can help make them better. And so one of the things that we are really promoting are like restorative justice practices within our schools and things to kind of shift the cycle and be more proactive. We heard about the school to prison pipeline. Wherever we can do and infuse this early on in the matriculation of our young people and try to get things to them at a very early age and try to get the systems in place where they're at the beginning is something that we are supporting. So putting the resources in on the front end so we're not dealing with all these things on the back end, and then putting people together that's going to attack and change some of these policies and practices. We're having the same conversations we've been having over and over and over again. And so one of the things we want to do, we have 3 million members. We're in almost every single school district across this country. In 2015, we put the gauntlet in the ground and said, listen, if we got 3 million members, we need to be out there doing something. We need to be out there saying something. We need to start saying that this is a system that needs to be changed, whether it's the education system, whether it's the criminal justice system, whatever it is, it needs to be changed. We need to put the emphasis back where they belong on the human beings that we're trying to deal with. Put respect back in there. When I talk about respect, I'm not talking about conformity. I'm talking about valuing and honoring one another. And when you value and honor someone, you try to do the very best you can to make that person better. Yeah. But when you're dealing with certain situations like that, they're not thinking about making people better. They're thinking about trying to punish and hurt. We've got to switch that around and pull the bases up so we can go in and start really transforming some of them.
I'm glad you said that about the conformity, because, yeah, he deserves a round of applause for that. Many people believe that, you know, when we want people to respect and discipline, that's about conforming, and that actually becomes a part of teaching practice.
Yes.
Go ahead,
I
Judge.
just wanted to make a point about the for-profit prisons. And there are charts all over the internet that show this, which tells me that we need to be following the money all the time and understanding that the criminal justice system is intrinsically connected. After President Obama had come out with the order canceling the contracts for the for-profit prisons, their stock value went down more than 50%. On the eve of the election, as the numbers came in for Donald Trump, you will see that the charts, their stocks went off the roof. They went through the roof on the eve of the election. So we already knew what this election meant. And so we really need to be following the money and understanding that the criminal justice system is based on how much money comes in and who's making money in the Department of Corrections.
Well, based on who voted, black women knew what the election meant.
Well,
But I just wanted to change it a little bit, the course, because I want us to also address or talk about some of the things that we think actually need to be reformed in the criminal justice system. We always talk about things need to change, they need to be reformed, something's wrong. What are some things that actually need to be changed, that need to be reformed, some low-hanging fruit, and then some long-term things that we have folks in here that can do something about? You can start, yeah?
No, thank you. Add something, I want to make one quick point and then move on to that point. But first, as she talks about private prisons, let me say what she's absolutely right, but show you how they're playing the game. The largest private prison industry in the country, at the same time, changed its name. It went to something as outrageous, well, as, I don't know how to call it. They changed their name to CoreCivic. But nobody knows what that means, do you? I don't either. CoreCivic. So the largest private prison industry in the country right now is called CoreCivic. So it doesn't even sound like they're in the prison game, does it? But we have had to go, and I'll move to your question in just a minute.
I won't let you.
We've had to go even to banks to ask them not to give them a line of credit. Because as the money started going down, the profits started going down, by no means do we want banks to support it to go back up. So we've sat down with a number of banks. I won't name names right now because they're doing us a favor right now, and CoreCivic is sweating it out. And we want to keep them in that position. Now, let me stop here for a minute on private prisons and go to the question
right.
that's asked. If you repeat the question one more time.
Well, I mean, that's all right, brother. That's all right. That means you didn't listen to anything I said, and you had in your mind what you was going to talk about already. That's why you on the NAACP.
That's right.
That's all right. I get it, brother. I'm not offended.
Let me give you the.
No, you already talked. Enough. No, go ahead.
Let me give you the broad, simple directive. We have to eliminate mandatory minimum sentences. We've got to give the discretion back to the judges, as we were saying. We go through a very arduous process in deciding who these judges are going to be to make these decisions, and then we take the power away from them to deal with the real challenging issues before us. If you look at some of the things that are going on, let me just put it in these terms. I went to the Coleman Prison Facility, one of the largest in the country, down just outside of Orlando, Florida. It's an amazing thing to go to a huge prison facility right next to Disney World. But indeed, that's where they are. And we have an NAACP unit, actually 3, within that prison. We believe in helping to organize them there so we prepare to bring them back outside and hopefully put them on the straight and narrow so they have some options and some support. And so we don't see the level of recidivism that we too often see. As we were beginning to talk this, I met a young man and said, I want to talk to you just a little bit afterwards. I'm talking to about 100 medium security prisoners at the same time, all members of our unit, by the way, black, white, Hispanic, and otherwise. He came to me and said, Mr. Shelton, I'm in here for committing one crime where I robbed 5 people at the same time. Now, I'm not going to tell you I was innocent, because I'm not. I had a gun when I did it. I didn't pull the trigger. No one got hurt. No one got injured. But I am now spending 265 years in prison as a result of stacking. It's what the process is, they call it. It was one crime, but they multiplied it by all the different subcomponents of a robbery with a gun, and many, many other things they added to each individual person, though it happened at the same time. I still talk to that young man from time to time. My hope is that we can get him out of prison long before that. Because there's no question, he should have spent what he's already done. He spent 10 years in prison already.
Okay,
There's no excuse for him being there now, but I keep following the money trail. And the money trail keeps leading back to those that want to profit.
Let me grab some of these other people to get in this thing,
Yes,
too.
sir.
All right. So, I mean, you know the question, everybody else was paying attention, right? All right, so,
And if we weren't, we wouldn't say so right
yeah,
now.
you jump right in. Yeah.
I mean, I think you.
I am a former principal, an educator, all right, let's make it clear. Yeah, so,
So you asked this question about what does justice look like, and I was thinking about that in the context of how it plays out in different communities. So we're here in the state represented by the mighty Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman. We've got the mayor of the biggest city in New Jersey, one of the best cities in the country, led by one of the best mayors in the country, Mayor Baraka. And so I think a lot about how does justice play out in New Jersey. And it's interesting because New Jersey is a state where we've seen that in the youth prison context and the adult prison context, they both fallen by 50%. The composition, the population of prisons in both the adult and the youth systems have fallen by 50% in the last 10 years. But as the prisons have fallen in their population, racial disparities have exploded.
Right.
So that today in New Jersey, a state of more than 8 million people, 15% of whom are black, there are 15 white kids who are in prison in the whole state. 15, right? And you're reacting to that because you're like, wait a minute, a state of 8 million people, 15% of whom are black, there are 15 white kids who are incarcerated. Now there's a reason for that. And that is because when white children do things that kids do, and if we get honest, we weren't always church-going righteous folks. We did some ill things way back in our past. We don't want to talk about it now, but if you get honest, we did some things, maybe they were even illegal, right? Well, when white kids in New Jersey do illegal things, the default for them is to by any means necessary, keep them at home. So if they have interaction with the police in their communities, the police officers are like, oh, it's just adolescent behavior. We know you're good. You're probably going to go on to be a judge or a doctor. Do better. Go home. If they go to the police precinct, there are these things called station house adjustments. And those allow for people at the station house, police officers, to give them a reprimand and to send them back home. If they appear before a judge and they get a Judge Victoria Pratt, that judge is talking about restorative justice. Well, you harmed the community because you did this thing. It was illegal, but we know you're a good kid at heart. Don't do it again. Go back home. And it is the exceedingly rare circumstance where New Jersey will incarcerate a white child, which is why there are just 15 white kids incarcerated in a state of more than 8 million people, 60% of whom are white. That is a vision for what justice looks like. It is the idea that when kids do things, they're doing adolescent things, their brains are not yet fully formed, they can get past this period and go on to be very productive folks, maybe even the President of the United States. Real talk. But if you think about the experience of black children in New Jersey, the default is incarceration first. And so part of our vision for transforming justice, and here I'm talking about youth justice, but it applies in the adult context, is that we got to think about kids as kids who do things that we've all done, and the default should be to keep that kid at home. And I love Jesslyn's point about looking at the history of the way that there's been an attack on black and brown bodies. I know we're in Washington, D.C., and I know this is a highly politicized environment, but we got to be really careful about this idea that one party has been better to black folks than another. Right? We do this right around election time, and this is a contested moment in history for sure, but let's be honest about the role that the other party has played in ravaging black communities through the criminal justice system. Bill Clinton was chief among the worst. And so really for us, no matter who's in power, it really happens from the ground up in our communities that we have to be truth tellers. And we have to be the ones to talk about what justice looks like for us and hold those elected officials accountable to our vision for what justice is. And part of it really is imagining how the default for our kids really should be at home and far, far away from the places that we often see them, which is incarcerated spaces.
After Ryan gives all these grim stats on New Jersey, I have to answer the mayor's question and say that what's happening in Newark is what the future of criminal justice should look like. And it takes commitment from local government. And so for our young people, we have started a youth court. Right. And so what does that allow? It, one, allows the judge to have discretion, and not only discretion, but it gives the judge tools. So you have a mayor who supports and pays for it because this is important. So what happens? A kid gets in trouble, they have the opportunity to have a station house adjustment, and what has to happen? The chief and director of police have to understand and have to direct their officers that these kids deserve a second chance and they're salvageable. But that comes from the head. It comes from the executive branch to send these children there. These kids come to a peer-based youth court where the teenagers themselves hear the cases and impose a sanction. And not only do they impose a sanction, but you have good peer pressure, so you have the kids who have been trained and who are doing well in school doing the sanction with the kids who are getting in trouble. And what's been great about this when we're talking about the school district, it now gives the school district another avenue, because now we know that all of these zero tolerance policies have created this prison to, the school to prison pipeline, not to mention for the girls, the sexual assault to prison pipeline. And so now the school, we know those regular infractions that they would go see Principal Baraka for, they don't get to see him for those things. Instead, the police get called, and if they're 18, they end up before me. Right. Now these kids have an opportunity to go before a youth court, and the school district will accept that sanction without now having to suspend this child and suspend this child numerous times, which will ultimately lead to expulsion. For adults, what do? We have an alternative sentencing program in court. So a person who would otherwise get jail in other parts of New Jersey for the exact same infraction, they get an opportunity to come before me, the tough but fair judge, and they get social services and they get community service. It is not soft on crime, it is smart on crime, right? Yes. We have social workers in the courthouse. We have nonprofit organizations that the city supports and that we support, and I hate a poverty pimp, so I go out and visit nonprofits. I go out to see what they're doing with the defendants who come before me. They're held accountable, they have to come. If they don't do what they're supposed to do, then they get their jail time. But what happens when the courthouse becomes a place that you can go to for help? Right. What happens? And so that, I'm telling you about that because that is something that can be put in your toolbox and it could happen. It could happen by the next budget. And it could bring this 12 million jail admissions down.
Absolutely.
That's what we did. We didn't wait for the state to get on board. Newark said, we're going to hand, because these are our folks and we're responsible for them. Generations. A father is locked up and the son, I saw him, I'm like, why are you still here? Oh, because my father. Generations of children and parents. We owe it to them. We owe it to them. They're our communities. What did Rabbi Prince said that neighbor is more than just a geographical location. It is a moral obligation. So we have both a moral and a professional obligation to make sure that we take care of the folks who live amongst us.
So I want to push y'all to stay on that message just a little bit because I want us to talk about, again, some of the low-hanging fruit, some of the pieces that we can actually do to move the needle on this thing. We have to be brilliant enough to analyze a problem, but courageous enough to solve it.
Yeah.
So I want us to focus us on some of the things that we should be doing when we get out of here immediately to kind of reverse this thing.
So I'll jump in there. So what Ryan and Judge Pratt talked about was taking a holistic approach to transforming and rethinking how the criminal legal system operates, right? And in order to do that, you have to think about interventions and where are the points of intervention to transform the system along the continuum. And that's from the very beginning, dealing with policing, right? And this is a huge issue, right, in the media, and we hear about it and we see Black men and women killed at the hands of law enforcement often, unfortunately. But there are things that you can do locally to address that issue, right? That is a very localized problem, and it starts with who you elect to be your mayor, who you elect to be your city council members, because that's who determines who the police chief is. And then who the police chief is determines who they hire to be police officers. And if that police chief decides, I'm not gonna hire people with backgrounds in military and things like that, but I'm gonna think about law enforcement officers who have maybe social work backgrounds, right? Because a lot of what police do are dealing with social problems, which is not what they should be doing. But also thinking about how do you limit the role of police in our society? Should they be engaged in schools and in discipline with children in schools? Probably not. Should they be dealing with traffic instances, right? Pulling people over. Should they be dealing with handing out tickets and citations for not cutting your lawn? No, but that's what they do. That's how they get involved, and that's how many people have their first interaction with law enforcement is through those types of things. We have to think about when people are arrested for these offenses, what happens to them? We criminalize poverty by requiring people to pay a monetary bail in order to get out of prison. That doesn't mean that they actually committed the crime. We have totally turned the old aid adage of innocent until proven guilty on its head and have forgotten all about that. And we have started that jail population that the judge is talking about has a lot to do with the fact that most people just can't afford to get out. Most of them can't afford to get out. And that has implications for everything else down the end of the stream, right? Downstream. Sentencing. If you spend more than 3 days in jail, you're more likely to be sentenced and found guilty of the crime and to be sentenced longer. So we have an issue there. I think some other issues, and this is one that Ryan is working on, and also I want everyone in this room to know about, is what happens when people come out of prison? How are we welcoming them back to our communities? How are we allowing for them to be productive citizens and members of our communities? Are we putting up barriers to them being able to get jobs? Are we putting up barriers to them being able to get housing, education, being able to even go on school trips with their kids? Many people with records can't even do that. Why, right? Being able to do things that they learn in prison, like barbering, and then they come out and try to get a license, but that state says that if you have a criminal record, you can't get a license. Exactly. So how are you ever supposed to provide for your family? So I think there are intervention points, and then voting. People with records in many states are not able to vote or have barriers to voting. And there are three ballot initiatives that I want you all to know about. One is in Florida, where Florida could actually restore the right to vote to over 1 million people if this ballot initiative passes. That's 1 million people, the majority of them are African American. There's a ballot initiative in Ohio that would do the same, and then Ryan is working on some in New Jersey that he can talk about. I don't know if his ballot initiative might be a legislative fight, but those are some of the low-hanging fruit that I think that all of us can engage in at the local level, and there are opportunities for those reforms that are happening nationally, and try to take this approach.
I was just gonna
Yeah,
also.
just to basically piggyback off what Ms. Cooks basically stated, I want to speak from a personal perspective. I was brought up in Miami, and actually was affected by the drug trade. President Trump's new mantra, he wants to be in law and order, is actually a reification of exactly what Nixon said back in the 60s. And also continued on through President Reagan, Bush, et cetera. But my family was significantly affected. My mother was incarcerated. All of my younger brothers were incarcerated. One of my brothers was one of the first juveniles in the state of Florida to be sentenced as an adult at the age of 14. So, you know, I could speak from a perspective that state of Florida literally stopped programming during my younger brother's incarceration, which prohibited him from obtaining his GED. It's one of the most difficult things. You see a grown man when he exits the prison unable to find a job because he went to prison when he was 14. So I truly believe that the funding of prisons and programming, Federal Bureau of Prisons has this mantra that incarceration, the reentry starts upon the first day that a person is incarcerated. I think that we need to also invest in prevention programs to keep our children from going to prison in the first place. I was one of those at-risk kids, and thank God through the military I was able to learn that family structure, et cetera. And now my children have moved on to college and graduated, and also now serving in the military as well. But the whole point, what I'm trying to make is, if you don't fund the prisons and you don't establish programming for people to actually rehabilitate their relationship with their family, there's a lot of people, including my siblings, that actually lost contact with their families while they was incarcerated. The first thing that they need to know is that they have a family that they're going to come home to. And if you don't actually create family programs to allow them to rehabilitate their relationship while missing, you know, for many of the young youth period of being without parents. I was one of those people who's not raised with my mother or my father. I could promise you it's going to be very difficult, and the doors of the prison are going to be waiting for them to come back and recidivate. So I definitely know that regulation on we have a lot of offenders actually receive certification for building trades, for becoming a plumber, electrician, etc. Yet and still the states that they actually return to prohibit them from employment. You know, so what do you think actually is going to happen? It's going to, it's basically round and robin back to the prison. You have Cory Booker and others that are actually focusing on ban-the-box initiatives. Those things right there need to be dealt with. You know, we want to believe that what we do behind the prison walls and fences around this country in 122 facilities, many of the people are really dedicated knowing that we're in a people's business. We're in a people's business to send people back out into their communities as law-abiding citizens. We take that very seriously, and it hurts us to see people come back to the prison system after they've actually went out and really tried to actually gain meaningful employment. You know, and it hurts us. So I truly believe that regulation reform and also prohibiting states from allowing people to get meaningful employment, initiatives like ban the box, restoration of rights, you gotta incentivize that. And I definitely want to back that initiative in the state of Florida as well, where I live. I truly believe those are the things that need to be focused on for meaningful and criminal justice reform, smarter sentencing as well. So that's just my perspective from being a correctional professional.
You wanna jump in? Go ahead.
And I just wanted to add that, okay, when we're talking about true reform, first of all, the system is broken, right? I said that a few days ago, and somebody's response to me, which I think is profound, he said, you know, the system is not broken, it's working exactly as it was designed to work.
Yes.
And it is designed to put away, ruin the lives of black and brown people.
Yes.
So we have to start from that perspective, first of all. So the system is broken, but it's at the same time working like it's supposed to. So any reforms that we talk about initiating to this system are really nibbling around the margins. Because really the system needs to be reimagined, reinvented, taken out of the punishment paradigm and put into a paradigm of love and restoration for people. Those are big, big, lofty goals. So in the meantime, I think one of the most important, particularly on the federal level, Eric talked about the Smarter Sentencing Act earlier. sponsored by Senator Durbin, but also on the House side, sponsored by Representative Bobby Scott. And introduced by Representative Bobby Scott on the House side. And that particular bill addresses mandatory minimums. Again, the driver in the federal system of mandatory minimums are attached to drug laws. All drug laws have a mandatory minimum attached to them. And so until you reform mandatory minimums in the federal system, there is no reform in the federal system. So that is my first suggestion in terms of reform.
So before we go forward, I want to, it's mentioned many times, I want to give Representative Bobby Scott an opportunity to address us before he leaves. So thank you. The stairs over here. Are you going to hop?
Thank you, Mayor Baraka, and I want to thank all of our panelists, but most of all, I want to thank Bonnie Watson Coleman for having an intelligent discussion about criminal justice policy. We really know what real criminal justice reform ought to look like, but in criminal justice policy, it's just a simple choice. We can do what reduces crime and saves money based on evidence and research, or we can codify a bunch of slogans and sound bites, fear-mongering and foolishness. They'll help some politicians get elected, won't do anything but run up the incarceration rate to where we have more people incarcerated in America proportionally than anywhere on earth by far. Just wasting the taxpayers' money. One study showed that we got so many people in jail that it's actually adding to crime rather than reducing crime. Our incarceration rate is so high that you have too many people in jail, children being raised by parents in prison. You got too many people with felony records, can't find jobs. At some point, you lose any criminal justice value for incarceration, and you're just wasting the taxpayers' money, making things worse. So we have to make the choice. And once you make the choice, we know what to do. We've heard the solutions. One is you got to get rid of mandatory minimums. They've been studied. You know they don't make sense. They waste the taxpayers' money. There have been plenty of studies, and that's one thing you can do. I've had a couple of things that, in terms of legislation, if you just judge legislation, I picked 4 things. What does it do for mass incarceration? Is it going to make matters better or worse? What does it do for racial disparities? To make it better or worse? How are you fighting the war on drugs intelligently as a public health problem or ignorantly as a criminal justice policy? And finally, are you using evidence and research or slogans and sound bites? You can tell, you can look at the bill and know whether a researcher was in the room when the bill was drafted. If you look at those 4 things, you'll be able to separate the good from the bad. Did mention legislation. I've introduced the Safe Justice Act, which starts with investments in prevention and early intervention to get young people on the right track, keep them on the right track. Police training, after you've gotten through the debate of whose fault it is that so many people are getting shot, the solution will include police training. If you don't have any money for police training, you've wasted your time on the debate. Bail reform to make sure it's risk-based rather than wealth-based. When you get to court, drug courts and other problem-solving courts, so you don't have people twirling through the revolving door coming back when you could have solved the problem. When you get to sentencing, eliminate mandatory minimums, because that's where you're just wasting the taxpayers' money. When you get to prison, put more services in there to reduce recidivism. When they get out of prison, more money for second chance programs. Now, we were close to getting it passed, but unfortunately, the chair of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, who loves mandatory minimums, introduced a bill that it reduced the mandatory minimums, but then it expanded mandatory minimums. And to see what you're doing, you got to get a CBO score to say to all the pluses and the minuses. On mass incarceration, it was as close to a 0 as you can get. 2.2 million people in jail. CBO score said in the fullness of time, you'll have 1,000 people fewer. At 2.2 million, you need 22,000 to get to 1%. 1,000 fewer people in jail. And unfortunately, there was no debate about it. People kind of made the political compromise, and when the dust settles, nothing happened. But we know that these programs work if you use an intelligent approach. Texas did it. Texas was sitting up there looking at an appropriations request for $2 billion to keep up with their expanding prison population. One state, $2 billion. Somebody said, that's a lot of money. Maybe anything else we can do. Well, somebody said, well, if you invest about 10% of that, about $200 million, into intelligent stuff, prevention, rehabilitation, maybe we won't have to spend all $2 billion. So they tried it. They spent about $200 million rather than $2 billion. And when you looked up, they had reduced crime so much that not only did they not have to build any new prisons, they started closing some of the prisons they had, reduced crime and saved money. So we know that these programs work. We know they can save money. We know we can reduce crime. And we know that mandatory minimums, if you have a bill that expands mandatory minimums, you just know right off the bat that it's not serious legislation. And that's why the comments were so appropriate. So I want to thank Bonnie Watson Coleman for focusing attention on what actually works. I'm having a workshop tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock in room 201 on evidence-based approaches, what the evidence shows works in actually reducing crime and saving money. So if you like this workshop, come to that one. We'll have a continuation of this. But I can't say enough about Bonnie Watson Coleman taking the intelligent approach, not following the slogans and sound bites, fear-mongering and foolishness, but doing something intelligent to reduce crime, save money, and actually protect our public. Thank you very much.
Thank you again. I think that chord, struck home for me and for many people, especially who are leading cities, that actually criminal justice reform helps us to reduce crime. That's important. I think that is a message that we need to kind of push here, and maybe we could talk about it a little bit, because before we open up the floor to questions, I think you give about five minutes or so around that, because I think people believe that when we talk about criminal justice reform, and somebody said it earlier, that we are being soft on crime, and it means that we want everybody to get out of jail, and we just are so liberal, we want people to hit people over the head, particularly in cities like Newark, who have had an intractable problem with crime and violence. We've been on a downward trend lately, but that is something that our grandmothers who are very, very concerned about. When we talk about criminal justice reform, what does it mean as it relates to the reduction of crime itself? Anybody want to jump in?
Well, let me start and go so I can listen. So, it's fascinating when I talked earlier about how the interconnectedness between the systems will operate. So a lot of the things that found their ways into schools are found in the criminal justice system. 3 strikes, you're out. Mandatory minimums, broken mirrors theory,
right?
Zero tolerance. And so some of the things that we are promoting, that we're trying to work with our schools, the things that you can help in your community, as we talk about being more proactive, starting at the very beginning. We talk about the school-to-prison pipeline. Understanding the school-to-prison pipeline is more than just suspension and expulsions. It's all of those things that put our young people in contact with law enforcement through policies and procedures, metal detectors, cameras, things like the SROs and all of those things as well. And so some of the things that we are trying to promote is, number one, have some of those data discussions, bring that data to the forefront. We talk about a lot of data sometimes, but having educators, having people see what that data looks like, and then once you see it, coming up with some proactive approaches about, number one, expanding the voice of the students and the families and the policies and procedures that go on within the school. And that's a very important piece, because if you can do that in the school, you can also do that in the public, basically saying, the people who are mostly impacted by what's happening need to have the strongest voice in terms of determining how that policy and that procedure operates. And we're trying to build powerful coalitions between our local unions, within the families and the students within those schools, to build coalitions that force districts and can force communities to make those changes. Stop suspending kids for things like disrespect when no one even understands what disrespect means, right? And so just looking at those little things. And the other thing is, yes, getting rid of those zero tolerance policies and taking it out of the hands of the rule and having schools embrace restorative justice, using that philosophy inside the schools, which grounds everything in going back to, I think someone used the word here, humanity, and that's what this is grounded in. Looking at everyone from a dignified humanity standpoint, building that relationship with them and understanding that I'm less likely to do something harmful to you because you're a human being and I'm helping you. You say that and people say, well, that sounds like fluff, but that's just the bottom line. You won't.
That's very true.
Some of the things that are happening because people are not looking at black people as human beings.
Right on.
And so and to flip that around, that's the very first thing we should talk about. There are some things happening that you would not want another person to go through. When I hear 15 white people in jail in a state that has millions, that disturbs me. But that just goes back to the basic of we need to fight vigorously for making sure that our voices are in the place and that we have coalitions of people to help tear down some of these policies. NEA is supporting legislation in Congress around private prisons, getting rid of private prisons, supporting legislation that also deals with getting rid of those mandatory minimums, because we realize that all of this stuff is interrelated. And so just making sure that when we combat the school to prison pipeline with those policies and procedures that are in place and incorporate new ideas of how our schools operate, that translates in our communities because our schools are microcosms of the communities in which they serve.
15 white people in prison, actually a good thing. We just want that to happen for us too.
Correct. Thank you.
That's all.
And again, I'm unique. I actually work behind the prison walls of fences. Actually, am discharged with the responsibility to negotiate policy. So I too want to sit back and listen to some suggested input when it comes forward. So I just wanted to speak and get out of the way. I truly believe that we need to stop the for-profit prisons. And I've actually endorsed Senator Bernie Sanders' bill, and I'm going to definitely, when I get back, look at definitely endorsing Bonnie Wasser's bill as well, the Congresswoman. But I want to be able to come up with programs, and that is what I have done. I did that predominantly with the former director, Mr. Charles Samuels, and working with Sally Yates and also Deputy Attorney General and also Attorney General Eric Holder to go back to the model of devising programs for people to be rehabilitated. We have seen less funding coming in under Jeff Sessions. I've actually been repudiating everything that he's actually been trying to do, cut staffing because he wants to go back to a more punishment model versus a rehabilitative and corrective model. So got some good news on that perspective, and I really thank the Congress for actually standing against that, especially one of the bills that I wanted to support, but I couldn't because it actually wanted us to change all the makeup of the Bureau of Prisons. And it actually would have basically set us back years, which is the First Step Act. I believe any First Step Act need to include some form of mandatory minimum prison reform. If not, you will not get it done, even if the Democrats actually take over the House side. So I want to be able to push this president. He actually stated he was going to engage in criminal justice reform, and I want to basically hold him to the fire. And also the Republican and House, who's actually been out there supporting it. So I could do that from a law enforcement. I just want you all to know this is not popular with among my constituents. We are in the business of incarcerating people and maintaining our employment, and we saw the release of 30,000 plus offenders in our custody, control, and care. And the former two directors actually testified on the Hill that for-profit prisons was only there to basically supply us additional beds. Well, what is their excuse now? So we work with Sally Yates to put a policy in place to basically eliminate the private prisons. Jeff Sessions comes in within 2 weeks of him being in office and rescind that policy. We need to go back and basically try to push hard on this because that is a problem not only for our staff. Inmates are the for-profit prisons are able to pick and choose the inmates in our low security facilities who are healthy and return the ones who are sick, so the taxpayers could basically take on their medical care versus that hurting their profits. That is sick. And to know that that kind of policy persists without correction from the Congress is obnoxious to me, to say the least. But I definitely want to focus on more funding for programming. We do have professionals that really believe in what they do. They know we're in the people's business. We need to basically get funding to our staff to be able to do their work. And we need to find a way to stop people that are teachers, that are working in the building trades and vocational training, that actually are being augmented in the replace of missing correction officers on a daily basis for routine and administrative convenience. We have the executives actually going out, rubbing elbows with the private prisons. You got private prisons actually hosting their conventions at the Trump properties. You know, so it's sickening what is actually going on. But the executives are actually brushing elbows with them, and we have also executives actually going to work for those private companies. Former directors of the Bureau of Prisons, Harley Lappin, is the head of CoreCivic, and now is on the board for CoreCivic. They changed the name because of all the for-profit prisons that actually was destroyed and had people murdered in their facilities due to prison riots. So, you know, these things have to be called out. We have to do press releases. Community leaders have to get involved. We have to have churches also involved. The church is absolutely missing out of this dialogue, and I hate to basically criticize, but that is the truth. Where's the church in our community? Where's the church that are helping black and brown people being able to come out of prison? And the church is absolutely missing, and they should be actually an extension into the prisons to basically allow these people to know they have support.
Ryan, go ahead. I want to introduce somebody else before we're going to have to go to the audience in a minute. But I want you to close us before we go into, bring the commissioner up for a second, and we have some questions.
I guess a quick word. I was thinking about sort of what one of the takeaways from the panel is, and you know, I mentioned that there are 15 white kids incarcerated in New Jersey, not to make the point, to the mayor's point, that we should be incarcerating more white kids, but instead to say that we can do incarceration differently.
Yes.
And that should apply, right, to our kids. And so in New Jersey, we were looking at these racial disparities. I mentioned that New Jersey has the highest black to white youth incarceration disparity rate in America, 30-1. And we started working with the Congresswoman, we started working with Mayor Baraka, and we really started to the point about the churches. We moved across New Jersey, engaging people on the issue of youth incarceration. Absolutely. And why is it this way? And if we could imagine it, to Justin's point, differently, what would it look like? And what emerged over about a year of doing that really intensive outreach across New Jersey was folks were like, you know what, one thing we know is the current system is operating, again to Justin's point, precisely as it was supposed to operate. Yes. The first youth prison in New Jersey was opened in 1867, which is 2 years after the end of the Civil War. And so we literally in New Jersey moved from a period of a war, then on the other side of a war, to some kind of freedom for formerly enslaved Africans, to incarceration. And so folks like, we just need to end this current system and fashion a new one. And so we organized people across New Jersey. We had a rally called 150 Years is Enough. Wow. This prison was 150 years. This was last year, and 400 or more people showed up outside of this prison called Jamesburg. And we had a lot of support from the mayor, from the congresswoman, from people across New Jersey who said, you know what, we know for sure the current system is entirely broken as it applies to us. We want a new one. And something happened on Chris Christie's watch as he left office. He announced the closure of 2 of the 3 youth prisons. And I offer that because I think, though this is an incredibly difficult national moment, we as black folks have only really known difficult moments in this country, right? Democracy for us has always been contested, always. And so you could imagine on the other side of a black president twice, Donald Trump in office. In fact, if we get honest, there would really be no other response to Barack Obama twice than a Donald Trump. And so because we know this was coming, we also know that we've always effectuated change from the ground up in our communities. And so I think the empowering thing for us from this talk is when we go back to our spheres of influence, we are to organize around these issues, to tell the truth, to tell our story, and then to push those who are elected to work with us. Some of them are inclined. If you're not in Newark, you're not going to have a Mayor Baraka. I'm sorry. If you're not in Newark, New Jersey, you're not going to have Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman. But you can find some progressive elected officials in your communities. Work with them to push the broader group of folks to do what we want them to do. And that can happen really depending on the pressure you place under any administration. I believe if this can be done under Chris Christie, it can be done in your place too, I promise you.
So I'm gonna let you say something, Judge.
Really
And I'm gonna just
quickly.
go through what the rest of the program is gonna be like real quick. So I'm gonna let the judge, because I love her so much,
Thank you very
do this.
very
And I want to be able to allow the Commissioner of Education of the State of New Jersey, Dr. Repolet, to speak. He's the first African-American Commissioner of Education we've had. I want him to get an opportunity to speak. Then we're going to go into question and answer from the audience, questions only. And then I'm going to do something different. I'm going to let the three women up here close us out, because these men have hogged the panel completely. I'm going to let these three women close us out and let these men listen to them before we get out of here. Well, okay, I'm going to let, better than that, I'm going to let our Congresswoman close it out. But I'm going to let them have a word. Go ahead, Judge.
I didn't want to leave without saying this also, because James G. would have a fit. Criminal justice reform, the future of criminal justice reform is getting more and more sophisticated. And you need to be conscious of that. When you hear words like risk assessment, facial recognition, ComStats, understand that this is a criminal justice reform strategy that is now reliant on algorithms. And the intention, as it's presented, is that we are taking the bias that a human being would have in approaching criminal justice. However, the algorithms have the bias of the creator, and the algorithms are just reinforcing bias police practices. So when you get home, read Weapons of Mass Destruction. When you get home, watch a TED Talk, mine too, but watch, there's a TED Talk, I can't remember the sister's last name, her name is Joy, and it's called The Justice League, where she does a lot of work about what these algorithms mean to people of color, particularly black people, and what data is being fed into the equations to come up with stuff. Because not only are we relying on them for police practices, but judges are now being forced to rely on them to make decisions about whether people get to stay in jail or come out. So we hear bail reform, and that's great. But what happens when you are a community judge and you know a person, and when the algorithm comes out, it says this person has to go to jail, but you know little Raheem just got a job, and that potentially some police practice where they had a task force in his ward of the city, he got picked up because he mouths off, you know how he is. And instead of being able to use your discretion, the algorithm tells you something different. So what I'm saying is, let's not let criminal justice reform happen to us. Because we know. We know. Because the war on drugs happened to us. It happened to us. So when you hear those things, show up. There's also letters on the internet from MIT professors who caution jurisdictions that are going into bail reform. If you're going to do this, make sure that you have these safeguards. We had all kinds of bail reform hearings at the courthouse all over, and people didn't show up. And now their kid's not coming home, and they want to call you about why doesn't he get to come home? Well, had you come, you'd been able to talk about what type of, well, yes, because I do say that, but yeah, but not because they're calling, and they're calling everybody. And so you would have been able to have those kinds of conversations. It is getting sophisticated, and the guys in Silicon Valley are coming up with more and more creative things to do and making more and more money. But make sure that these things that are supposed to be benefiting communities of color are not, once again, hurting us. So I couldn't leave without saying that.
So, I mean, I don't think everybody knows, but that's, I mean, that the context of that is New Jersey has bail reform, no bail system in New Jersey now. Is wrought with all kind of problems, and you know, part of it is because I don't think practitioners and community folks were involved in that. And what the judge hit on, right the nail on the head, was the algorithm is running the show. So it's like the Will Smith movie, you know, or Minority Report. That's why it's even better. You know, instead of a human racist running the thing, now you have a machine that has been programmed, right? that are now doing the same thing. So we're still trying to figure that out. So at this point, I'd like to bring our commissioner up, Dr. Repolet. Let's give him a round of applause, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman for allowing me to speak, to talk about social justice and how it affects our youth. And thank you, Congresswoman, for all the work that you've done calling for reforms for prison reentry programs, shepherding legislator on prisoner rehabilitation and release, and taking proactive steps. One of my first early events as the acting commissioner of the state of New Jersey, I attended a gun violence town hall meeting in Trenton with the Congresswoman, and I heard her passion. One of my second events as acting commissioner was I attended a gun rally event in Newark with the mayor, and our youth participated. So early on, my first events was regarding gun violence, and I thought about the school to prison pipeline. I talked about that a lot as a superintendent at Asbury Park in New Jersey. You know, and some of the work we've done there is that we looked at social and emotional justice, making sure that our students have the skills, making sure that they can have the ability to self-regulate. And you know, we also did proactive restorative justice in our school system. We actually had a program where we had parents in the community come in, and we did with the jails and stuff, and you go to court, expungement. We had expungement programs because it was important that we wanted the community to know that we care about them and not just our students. But I'm going to just talk real briefly because I'm not going to spend all day. But I had an event the other day with our faith-based leaders in the state of New Jersey. About 100 faith-based leaders in the state of New Jersey attended. It was the first one the Commissioner of Education in the state of New Jersey actually engaged in conversation with those faith-based leaders. And I talked about my time as an at-risk student. 7 schools in 13 years, welfare, parent, father was in prison, things of that nature, military veterans but couldn't find a job. So, you know, if you don't have a job, you have to go out and make a means. And what I learned was that the perspective in which I see education is totally different from my predecessors. You know, being the first African American, so I'm looking at educating students in New Jersey quite differently. You know, I attended my first commissioners conference in the state. Needless to say, I was the only person of color there. And I thought about it. I said, New Jersey, you know, with a progressive governor that decided to pick an African American practitioner as a superintendent to lead the state. But then I thought about my colleagues on that cabinet. This is my chance to talk about the lens in which we see and how we can look at innovation and think anew. Well, you have to have a different perspective before you can think anew. So I'm thinking about, you know, my colleague, Commissioner Marcus Hicks. He's the African American. He's the Commissioner of Corrections. Looking at our Lieutenant Governor, first Lieutenant Governor in the great state of New Jersey, Sheila Oliver. She's in charge of the community affairs, overseeing the cities. Then I look at the Secretary of State, Tahisha Way. Tahisha oversees elections, African American. Then I look at Secretary Zakiya Smith-Ellis. Zakiya oversees higher education. You know, and then I look at our General Beal. He oversees military and veteran affairs. He's African American. And now you have an African American leading education. So when you're talking about looking at reform and you're talking about, you know, at the ground level, and you talk about social services, well, we have to have a seat at the table, right? We have to have a seat at the table. You know, it's not a mystery or surprise that I'm the only African American. There's one in Kentucky right now in the state because there's not too many governors. So hopefully we have 3 African American governors running. We can kind of change that because when we start putting individuals in places that oversee our precious children, oversee our social programs, we can probably have change then. So when we talk about that school to prison pipeline, we have to have individuals in those schools and running those school districts and overseeing that state that understands the importance of educating all kids, but making sure that we have a social and emotional slant to it because our children are coming to school with a lot of baggage. How can we ask Hakeem to come in when Hakeem had a rough night. Parents had some issues. True story, had a young man when I was a principal at Carteret High School. He was absent the day that he was going to get a football scholarship to Rutgers. The head coach of Rutgers, Greg Schiano, came to the school. We were looking around for the young man. We called his house. I knew his uncle, and I called and said, well, Brian was homeless last night. He got kicked out the house because his aunt had an issue with him, and they kicked him out the house. Rutgers never showed up. They blackballed him, and as a result of that, this young man never went to college. So when you think about the baggage that we bring to school, right? And I'm thinking, okay, if you're talking about business and these private prisons are business, well, you got to have a farm system, right? Right? You have to have that candidate pool, the pool where you can actually draw from. So our schools, through this industrial revolution, one size fit all, has not changed. So now all of a sudden we are shepherding the students from school to prison. So we need to change that. So what we're doing in New Jersey, I can't talk about any other state, but I can talk about the work that we're doing in New Jersey. I'm extremely excited. Working with colleagues that have the most diverse cabinet in the country, working with mayors who actually get it. You know, I had a meeting the other day, and the mayor doesn't know this. I had a meeting with our former Governor McGreevy and Reverend Bartley, and they were talking about replicating the program, the reentry program that they did in Newark, and how we can partner with the state. So I'm thinking about the mayor gets it because he understands the continuing pathway, because being an educator, a teacher, and a former principal, he understands that our students have these needs that we must address, and this punitive way of addressing is not the right way, right? So thank you for what you're doing in the school system in the city of Newark, and thank you for our Congresswoman for just being a champion for social justice. I am very confident that our governor, Philip Murphy, a progressive champion, that he put together a group of individuals that will change the landscape in the state of New Jersey. Because the way we look at state government is totally different from the past. Because you have a lot of individuals that have experiences that other individuals never had before. And we're going to make sure that our students, especially in the education realm, we kind of end that school to prison pipeline. And what we're going to do is that we're expanding pre-K. We're looking at opportunities for free community college. These things are already appropriate in our budget bill. We're looking at STEM. So we have money, we have some talking about investing in education. Well, guess what? We invested $400 million. It's the largest investment in education over 8 years. We had a Republican governor for the past 8 years, did not invest in education, flat funded for 8 years. Now we have injection, and we have a promise from the governor and from our legislator to continue investing in education, because he talks about education being an economic engine. And I can say this, he must believe that, because I'm an educator and I sit on every economic development committee that the state of New Jersey has. And I sit there and he tells me, you have to work across intergovernment agencies because I need education at the top. So we're creating youth apprentice programs. I'm working right now with the Department of Transportation for our 18-year-old students to see if we can get them to be conductors, because there's a shortage. So here I am having the Department of Education looking to help Department of Transportation, higher education, to train students to get jobs in 2 years that will pay them $60,000 to $70,000. So if you want to end school to prison pipeline, you must have hope and opportunity. You must give them equity and access. And from New Jersey, Governor talks about a stronger, fair New Jersey. It starts with that, but hope and opportunity. Thank you, Congressman. Thank you for allowing me to speak. Mayor, keep doing what you're doing.
Excellent. So we're gonna open the floor up now to questions. We're gonna open the floor up now to questions. Des is walking around with the mic, so she'll grab you.
Good afternoon. My name's Atoya Deans, and I'm from the state of New Jersey. I have a question about the national conversation around criminal justice reform. I just want to know what happened to the national conversation around it, because it seems like the tide has turned against it. At one point, there was a moral argument for it, which many of you had stated about it being treating people with humanity. But now it seems, and then, my apologies, there was also an economic argument for it, and that engaged conservatives, and the moral argument seemed to engage progressives. But what has happened now? It seems like the conversation has shifted, and I would like to know why.
Jeff Sessions.
That's a great answer. I think I'll
Yeah, the Klan.
So, yeah, I think I think one of the what I heard from the commissioner who just was up here, I think is part of the reason why this conversation has shifted is who we elect to power, positions of power, and what their priorities are, right, and how they're going to represent you, right? It's not really about necessarily their political party. Sometimes it is, but it's about what they represent. What are their values? What are their morals? What are the issues that they care about and that they are going to represent you for? So we had a change in an administration, and we have a person that sits in the White House who came in talking about law and order, and the judge talked about this. Came in totally reverting us back to a time in the 1970s, and I'm like, people who lived there, it's okay. We are not in that age anymore, and we have to totally rethink and reimagine what justice should look like. So we had him, and then he appointed Jeff Sessions, and then that body up there of Congress approved Jeff Sessions, and that's why. I mean, that they sort of the bully pulpit of the administration has an impact on how this conversation is shaped around the country and why you hear it in national news and things like that. And so you start to hear this president is interested in prison reform. What does that mean? He's interested in prison reform. Well, if you look a little bit deeper, you would see the prison reform he's interested in gives a windfall to private prisons and excludes almost all of the people who could be helped by rehabilitative programs in prison. And that's why Mr. Young said his organization isn't supporting it, because it actually doesn't address the problems. I think that's one of the reasons why the national conversation has shifted.
If I can add to it, and I certainly agree with everything my colleague has said, keep in mind who we've actually put in these positions. Jeff Sessions voted against every piece of policy and legislation that changed the paradigm around our criminal justice system in the 30 years he served in the United States
You mean it wasn't the
Senate.
Russians?
I think the only thing that divides the two, quite frankly, is Jeff Sessions wants to make some cash off of this, and the Russians are still rather socialist in their approach to it. But all that being said, as we started watching the discussion under Obama was quite different.
Yep.
And I don't want to just say that because he's the first black president, but I'm glad we had him as the first black president. I sat down with Senator Obama, his first week in office, as a matter of fact, as we do with every new member of Congress. I took with me the copy of the NAACP's full legislative agenda, end racial profiling, address the issue of mandatory minimum sentences, alternatives to incarceration, eliminating the death penalty. We didn't even get to that point yet, y'all. They execute us more than anybody else do now. So they kill us slowly in the prisons, but they'll kill us very quickly with that lethal injection stuff and whatnot. But when I sat down with him, we walked through every single piece of legislation, as I do with every new senator, to talk about what we want from our communities. Just to give you a tiny bit of background, the agenda of the NAACP is not set by me. My job is to implement it. It's set by the 500,000 card-carrying members that live in New Jersey and every other state in the United States, but also on military bases in Italy, Korea, Japan, and anyway, you get the point. So it changed the debate. Just to give you a tiny example. When Obama came in, every time we talked about issues, whether it was criminal justice, economic development, we disaggregated the data. That means that we talked about how this affects black people, brown people, yellow people, how it affects everybody in the country. We disaggregated the data. And the media began speaking about those same issues. When the new president came in, what's his name? When he came in, it became a different kind of conversation. In other words, we were spending more time talking about what he wanted to grab on that bus than the issues that affected our community. Let me also say this, just an example. Look, we're nonpartisan at the NAACP. We invite whoever says they want to be our leadership, whoever wants to run for president. We don't care what party you're part of. We want to hear what your plan is for us. We invited Mr. Trump to come and talk about what he had in store for us, and he would not come. We were, at the same time they were having the Republican National Convention in Cleveland, the NAACP was having our national convention in Cincinnati. And since he'd flown that helicopter out there, quite frankly, so he could fly around the city a couple times before he landed in that park, because it was only a 3-minute helicopter ride and wanted to spend a little bit more time in the air, he wouldn't use it to fly over and spend some time with us. We invited him his first year in the U.S. presidency. As a matter of fact, what you gonna do for us? And once again,
Well,
we
you
finally,
already knew
at least
that.
we got a response back from him that
Yeah.
time. Sorry, can't come. You get the point. So the debate has switched to a point that the questions aren't being asked because we're so busy dealing with so many other issues.
Yep.
We got to ask the questions if we want the answers and hold him to it if he won't come forward and say what he's going to do. It works for us.
Right. Well, the president don't work for me. Go ahead.
So the reason for the discussion having changed is President Donald Trump.
They hear her.
Is Jeff Sessions, is Betsy DeVos.
That's right.
It's Ben Carson, housing, y'all, housing, you know? So we can just go on and on and on and on and on.
And he's black.
The conversation has changed because the priorities have changed. It's not for us, it's about getting us.
Brother, let me get some more questions in here. I'm gonna get some more questions.
I have a question back here.
Let me get some more
I have a
questions.
question back here.
Go ahead.
Tall guy back here. There we go.
There you go, bro.
How you doing, sir? I heard everybody speak. Real quick, first thing I want to say is I'm a former police officer. In this city, I protected this city. I was a former detective. As a matter of fact, I want to see more of us in law enforcement. We talk about changing. I never hear this narrative. I don't know why. It was the best job I ever had. Before I did that, I worked in higher ed. I have a graduate degree, higher education administration. I was on a path for university leadership. I decided to come here to D.C., go into law enforcement, get shot at a few times and everything else. Had a great time. The point I want to drive home.
That's pretty morbid there.
Yeah. I had a great time. I was young. It was the best job.
You said that after you said you got shot at.
Yeah, I'm telling you, that's how much of a paradigm shift it was. I'm from a little small town in Texas, so I was raised by folks who went to segregated schools. I know who I am.
Right. Let's
Exactly
get to
who
a
I
question,
am.
please.
So taking this into,
Yeah.
so my question that I wanted to add, it's more so a statement because I have been to several of these forums over the past few years. Now this is the first time I've actually started to come out and speak. You're not going to get BS from me. I can talk. My mentors are police chiefs across the country.
We're still
who
waiting
are my
for a
mentors.
question.
I understand, but this is very, very important. These are perilous times. And I know you're having the questions. We have forums and things going on. These are perilous times, and there should be other law enforcement in this room and who we connect with. So I'm sorry to take up too much time.
There's a few
but
law
I wanted
enforcement
to drive home the point of how important it is to have more people like myself who have spent years in law enforcement to have these connections and have these talks. Because you know what's happening? They're not listening. They're not hearing what we're saying in these forums.
Brother, you're
and
gonna
that's
have
what
to-
I
you're gonna
want to
have to
get
come up
through.
with a
So
question
that's all I want to say.
somewhere soon.
That's what I want to say. That's all I want to say. So, hey, have a good one.
You done abused your power like these other police officers around here. And that's all right, man. I did let it happen because you're black. I was about to throw you out. Nope, don't give him the mic. Nope. Let's get another question, please. Shh. Brother, another question. No, we wait. Brother, please. We need somebody to ask a question. Thank you. That's all right. That's fine. But the rules, that's okay. Brother, that's fine. Let's get another question. The rules were questions only. I said it 3 times. Questions only. Questions only. Yeah. As long as we getting shot, we're going to have these question forums over and over again. As long as there's injustice, we're going to have these forums over and over again. As long as Jeff Sessions is the AG, we're going to have these forums over and over again. As long as there's inequality, we're going to have these forums over and over again. Right? We're going to keep having them until we get rid of it. Right? Thank you.
I would like to thank Bonnie Watson Coleman, who is my congresswoman. I'm from New Jersey. I'm coming from the Great Shiloh Baptist Church of Trenton, New Jersey, with Reverend Darrell Armstrong as our pastor. I listened to all of you, and it's been very informative to me, and particularly from the gentleman who's talking about my state and those things that are happening that I wasn't aware of, but I'm very much enthused by it. I am very much impressed with all of you, the humanistic point that you have put forth and what you think that we need to do at the grassroots level. However, I have a question, several questions, and it's regarding the elimination of the illegal law on marijuana. Marijuana is considered to be a dangerous substance. So when you have decriminalization of marijuana laws around the country, guess what? If you use marijuana under the federal law, you are breaking the law. So you're talking about equal application of the law. That's where they're incarcerating our children. So our children need to be educated to understand, because maybe New Jersey is contemplating and having decriminalization of marijuana. They thinking, well, I can go out here and smoke all this and nothing's going to happen. But guess what? They can apply the law equally to you. All right? So I would like to see that eliminated at the federal level. Get that off the books, because then you can have the laws that decriminalize it to be that thing. What are you doing about it?
All right.
The second thing is the Voting Rights
Black
Act.
folks are hard, man. Yeah, I know that.
I
love y'all, though.
The Voting Rights Act, that you're saying that our children that are in the criminal justice system, they are labeled with not being able to vote when they come out.
Yes.
What is being done about that? Tied to what you're saying, that we need to tie it to them getting jobs out. When they come out, you're saying that people are being trained within our criminal justice system as a electrician and plumbers. What are you doing about to make sure that these children can get these jobs, having these companies to be able to empower them when they come out without any problems?
Go ahead.
Can I just quickly on the voting piece?
Yes.
Really quick on the voting piece, because the mayor said that we should shut up as the men. But this is a legislative question to the Congresswoman's point, and there's legislation that has been introduced in the great state of New Jersey that would enfranchise 100,000 people convicted of criminal convictions. The mayor's a big supporter of it, as is the Congresswoman. It's being championed by Senator Ronald Rice, Assemblywoman Shavonda Sumter, Sandra Cunningham, and it was introduced, and it needs the support of folks like you and others. And this is an important piece, right? So we talk about how on the other side of incarceration, folks don't have a stake in society. They're separated from the vote, democracy, the opportunity to earn a living. Voting has been shown to help reduce recidivism and increase reentry. So why would you take the vote away from folks, particularly when it's connected to a criminal justice system like New Jersey's, which is characterized by racial discrimination? So I encourage you to take a look at that bill. It was introduced in December. It needs the support of folks like you and others, and we can make New Jersey a model on restoring voting rights to people with criminal convictions.
On the federal level, as part of our imagining what criminal justice reform should really look like. So it's not just only the voting, but it's also prohibiting states from not licensing those individuals who legitimately got their training behind the walls, because we want returning citizens to be whole.
Right. And if I can add, on the voting issue, there's a packet like this I hope everyone will grab on your way out. It is the federal policy agenda on Capitol Hill for the NAACP. Of course, the Congressman is a big supporter of everything on here and much more. It speaks to, from the beginning of the criminal justice system to the very end, but speaking specifically to the issues of voting, it includes automatic registration. We're the only nation in the country, in the world, quite frankly, so-called industrialized nation, that you have to actually go and register to begin voting. Every other country, the time you hit whatever the voting age is, you're automatically registered to vote. What we want to tie it to, quite frankly, is our military our military system of registration. As you know, our kids at the age of 18 are automatically registered for the draft. If they're automatically registered for the draft, and all we have to do is implement it, should they not also automatically have a say in whether or not we go to war or not? It should automatically be registered to vote.
We have that in New
Fix the
Jersey.
Voting Rights Act. As you know, they stripped away Section 5, was the pre-clearance section of the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby versus Holder decision. We have a bill called the Voting Rights Advancement Act that begins to move to actually repair that system as well. We know we want front-end fixes on making sure that the votes that you cast be the votes that are counted. The Voting Advancement Act is a bill that actually includes a number of, a Voter Empowerment Act, excuse me, includes a number of provisions as we look forward. As I mentioned, in addition to automatic registration, at the time you step out of prison, you should also be automatically registered to be able to go and begin voting again. Just a quick point on that. Do you realize that in the state of Vermont, you can be an axe murderer and vote from your jail cell? And you never lose it. Puerto Rico is the same thing, is true as well. I talked to Pat Leahy, who's the senator from Vermont, when I asked him to support a bill that we were interested in called the Democracy Restoration Act. And he began to laugh a little bit. And I didn't understand why my friend, because he votes 100% with the NAACP's agenda, started laughing. He said, I apologize, Hillary. He said, the reason is you don't lose your right to vote in my state. As a matter of fact, I go into prisons to actually run for re-election. Think about that paradigm for a minute.
Yep.
But it is
All right.
also just happens to be, I hate to throw the race issue out, but you have to throw it out where
Let's catch some more questions. Let's get some more questions, please, some more questions.
Yes, my name is Deborah Borges, and my question is to the Honorable Judge Pratt. I'm a criminal defense attorney, and I want to make sure I understood what you just said, because it kind of shocked my spirit a little bit. Did you say that algorithms are taking away the judge's right to sit? I just need you to tell me what you said about that, because that ain't...
It's very true.
So in the bail reform model that we have in New Jersey, the officers now will call you and say the information is in the system, review it. Prior to bail reform, a judge would look at the criminal record, look at the charges, hear the information, and decide whether or not, what kind of bail the person would get, or if they were going to be released on their own recognizance. Now the system has changed that the judge is called not for bail, because we don't have money bail anymore, but to make a decision as to whether or not the person is put on a summons, which means that the officer lets them go home, or whether they get put on a warrant. After you look at all the information and you make a decision that there's probable cause to charge this person, you hit a button and it puts together, it's a PSA, and it puts together all the information. It looks at the convictions, it looks at the person's prior appearances in court, whether they failed to come to court or not, potential to reoffend, and so then the two numbers come up. And if it comes over 4 and under 3, one is whether or not the person is likely to come back to court, and the other flag will be whether or not the person is likely to reoffend. They say it's a guide, but it's information that tells the judge whether or not you should put this person on a warrant and send them up to the county jail.
So, what?
Well, I mean,
Yes.
you could if you're a judge
Here's
who's
a good
not
one.
afraid to
Right.
challenge the algorithm,
Right.
right? But what happens is that some judges see this algorithm
And they're gonna do
and
it.
they say, this says this person's a high risk, and if they get out and they do something,
Yep.
and I didn't follow the algorithm, then I have a problem. I mean, an example of this was we had a young man, and a problem, we had a young man who had been shot in the head, so he lost his eye. And his girlfriend must have come over to get something, and he scratched her. He couldn't see her, scratched her. Mother comes to court because he had been put on a warrant. The only information the judge was given was that this kid had a domestic violence charge, which most judges look at and are very cautious with. No one told the judge that the person literally could not see, that he really wasn't a danger to anyone. The day that he was sent up to the county jail was the day he was scheduled for his eye surgery. And so the judge was relying on the fact that it was a domestic violence case, and the flags came out in a way that maybe, but maybe not, and the person got sent up to the judge, up to the county. So those are instances where you're relying on this algorithm, but you don't have additional information about a person that if you are working in a misdemeanor court,
We know that it's only a small portion of the population that comes through the justice system.
So we're running out of time, so we're going to have one more, maybe two more questions. We may have two questions depending on the panel.
Keep your answer short.
Right, so if they give a speech, then we're going to have one question. If they respond properly, we can have two. So it's really up to them.
Would you like me to get those questions back to back so that they're both out
Yes,
there?
back to back, please. Thank you.
Okay. Mine is the opioid crisis, as we know, is now looked at as a major health crisis and dealt with through health interventions. But other drug-related offenses that are largely in our community are looked at as criminal offenses, whether the user or the seller. Are there any opportunities, or have there been any kind of legislation or things looked at to connect the other under the health care crisis with opioid offenses? I'm just wondering.
Yeah.
Let two questions, and then we're going to let you respond. One more
I could
question,
be
and that's
doing- I
it.
could be answering this one.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. I'm a retired Air Force person, and I wanted to know what kinds of courts can be done for military members when they, if they commit some sort of crime or whatever. Can we have a justice system that will basically handle the military separate from a regular civilian?
I'm going to try the first question.
Yeah, first question.
Okay. In addition to introducing legislation that would end for-profit prisons, I've also introduced a resolution that requires Congress to apologize for the war on drugs and provides for restorative justice for both individuals and communities that have been disrupted by the war on drugs for crimes that they would not be so charged and sentenced for now. It is a beginning, but it is the beginning of the discussion that needs to be had. Now, with regard to the special courts.
Yes, there are veteran courts popping up all over
Yeah.
the place, and through community courts in Newark, we actually had a veterans track where we would have the VA come to the courthouse and get people qualified for their benefits on site.
Right.
And connected. So they came once a month, and everything got done in one place for veterans.
Okay. All right.
In Newark, see me after this.
Sir. Nope. I love you, brother, but we can't do it. All right. We could debate when it's over. I love you, but we can't do it. Thank you. All right. Come on. That's all right. Come on. That's it. We're gonna close out. We're gonna allow. All right. Okay. I gotta give you all a book called COINTELPRO. Need to read it, because some of this stuff is on purpose. But I want to give the panel. I'm going to take the point of privilege here, because I want the Congresswoman to close us out up here today. But I want to give Jesselyn opportunity to say something, as well as Secours to say something. They haven't gotten the opportunity to talk about some of the stuff and some of these questions. So I'm gonna let them say something, and I'm gonna allow the Congresswoman to close us out.
So first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming to this session and just coming, spending your time, energy, and money coming to DC to come to the Congressional Black Caucus. One of the things I know every year when I come here, people are looking for something to do and a takeaway of how they can deal with the problems that they've heard about and try to move forward with solutions. I want to reemphasize exactly what the Congresswoman talked about earlier, and that is voting. We have November 8, 2018 elections are one of the most important and critical elections in our lifetime. And we have to not only vote ourselves, but we have to make sure our family members, our church members, our community, everybody in our communities are out there voting on November 6th in 2018, right? Secours talked about local elections and how important local elections are. One thing she didn't talk about, though, was local elections of district attorneys and how critical it is to get out and be conscious about the district attorneys that you are voting for and electing in your communities, because they have all the power in the system. But you have all the power to make sure that the right person gets in and is making decisions about how people are treated in the system and how people are charged in the system and who goes in and who gets out. District attorneys, critical part of our election process.
So I just want to wrap up by saying, one, thank you to the Congresswoman for hosting this important conversation. And then just to leave you all with three things, right? Just to remind you of what we discussed here, right? We can't continue to imprison our way to safety. We know what works to reduce crime, and it isn't incarceration, it isn't prisons. It's education, it's employment, it's housing, it's voting, it's keeping families together, it's providing wraparound services. So that's first and foremost. And when you're looking at who to elect, you need to look at it from that vantage point. Are they talking about those things in the context of criminal justice reform? It doesn't matter if they're Democrat or Republican. It could be two Democrats, and one could be saying the right thing, and one could be saying the wrong thing. You need to be clear about that. The second thing is that you want to make sure we're taking any reform effort is taking a holistic approach to that and looking at every intervention at every phase of the system, from the very beginning to what the police are doing and how they're doing it, to the end, to how we are reintegrating people back into society. So every point along that continuum. And then finally, you have to hold people accountable once you put them there. We always, we vote, not all the time, because we didn't vote in the last election. That's why we are where we are today. But when we vote, we then forget. We forget that we put those people in power. We forget that we put them there to do a job and that your tax dollars are paying their salaries. Okay? Your money, my money, is paying their salary. So they have to be responsive to you as long as you live in their district. They have to be responsive to you if they are on the House side. On the Senate side, they cover the whole state, so they have to be responsive to you, whether they are Democrat or Republican. And so you need to make sure that when they come up to Capitol Hill, that they are doing your bidding, that they are you are holding them to everything that they campaigned on, right? And paying attention to what's happening not only locally, but also federally. So that's what I want to leave you all to. And I want to thank again everyone for being here. It was a lively discussion. Thank you to our moderator, Mayor Ramona, for holding it down, keeping us on task.
So I have the pleasure of bringing back up our Congresswoman, Bonnie Watson Coleman. Let's give her a round of applause, please.
First of all, I want to thank the mayor because he's done an incredible job here. This is such an outstanding panel. He had to rope them in. He didn't have to really encourage them. He had to kind of rope them in, because they work in this space from so many different perspectives, and they have so much information to share with us. We could have done this for the whole weekend. Maybe one day we will, So this government is of and by the people. Okay, people, we have to do what we have to do because we change things. Let me say thank you to New Jersey, who's in the house here, and some of them. And some of them who, okay, come on now. And some of them who came down together. I want to mention a couple of things. PTSD. When I was in Israel, they talked about the children who had PTSD because they didn't know when the other folks were going to shell them, right? So they not only had shelters to go to quickly, but they had therapy in their schools. And it's because those children experience violence or the possibility of violence. And our children in a lot of the urban centers are having that same experience, scared from violence. And so, what happens when they go to school? They are categorized as troublemakers. So I'm really glad that we got Brother Dr. Repollet, who understands that phenomenon as the new Commissioner of Education, Because when those kids start acting out and then they get categorized, then they get put into special classes, then they get forgotten, and then you got to figure out, well, what are you going to do with them next? And you know what happens to them next. And I'm also glad he's there because you know what happens to little black girls in school? They get suspended 5 times greater than white girls who do exactly the same stuff. So I'm so glad that we have a black commissioner. There's so much that needs to be done in this field. We need to look at it holistically. We need to tear it apart piece by piece. And when we talk about reform, it ought to be reform. I'm not going to vote for not one doggone bill that's got mandatory minimums taken from it. At the same time, hear me. At the same time, it has these sort of add-ons of time or expansions of other things that really represents another form of mandatory minimum. That's not reform. When you see us talking about it down here, pay attention to the specifics of it. We have a very difficult time getting real criminal justice reform done because it, first of all, necessitates our speaking and thinking of people who look like us as human beings and expecting the highest, not the lowest. And so we need to approach this from when the kid goes into preschool, gets into elementary and middle school, and comes through high school. And then if a person commits a crime and has to go to prison, then we need to talk about that person as a returning citizen someday, and we need to do everything we need to do to prepare that person to come back into his or her family. There is still a prison strike going on. It probably, in the aggregate, became the biggest prison strike in the country. They're striking because of the terrible conditions in our prisons. They've given up this strike to some degree, and now they're in danger, and we better pay attention. Because those people, 97% is, how many, 77%, 67% of the people who go into prison come out of prison? They're coming into our communities. They're coming back to our families, and they need to come back ready and willing and able to work, to love, to reunify, and to live in safe communities. This is a lot of work that needs to be done, but it can be done. And I'm going to tell you, New Jersey, you got a progressive governor. Hold your legislature accountable. That's all I'm going to say on that issue. Y'all know what I'm talking about. We're going to have, if we do the things that we need to do, a Democratic Congress, controlled Congress, if we vote. And if we do, the greatest leverage we have against him is appropriations. We decide where the money is going to be spent. So that is our leverage. That is a movement towards our freedom. Let's make sure that we don't just vote, but that we make sure that everybody around us is eagerly waiting to vote. God bless you. Thank you for being here. This panel, most incredible panel you could ever have. Thank you, and God bless the work that you do.